So I want to start by talking about just some basic definitions. Burnout, we know, was added to the ICD-10 in the most recent edition, and it's coded as a state of burnout or a state of vital exhaustion, and it's under this parent code, problems related to life or life management difficulty. This is important for this kind of a group because we know that at least half of physicians report some type of burnout or at least one symptom of burnout throughout their career. And burnout impairs attention, memory, it impacts our quality of care. It's noted to be a huge cause. This causes to be related to family, responsibilities, juggling with work responsibilities, time pressure, having a lack of control in your work environment, a chaotic work environment. It causes people to leave the field, and obviously is a major problem that I feel like all hear about fairly regularly. Not right now, honey. Sorry about that. Moral injury is another thing that I want to define. So it's something that it's a term that actually came out of the military field. So John Shea, a psychiatrist treating Vietnam, that's coined the term, and it's quoted around 2014, as you'll see in that quote there. But he started seeing that this was different than traditional PTSD, or kind of related to PTSD, but it's the psychological distress that results from direct action or lack of action. That's a violation of one's moral code or ethical code, violation of your beliefs or expectations. And in the world of healthcare, it's being talked about as being unable to provide high quality healthcare and healing that physicians, clinicians, anybody who gets into the world of healthcare really wants to do. Shea defined it as a betrayal of what's right due to someone in authority making a decision that was in a weighty scenario. Carol Gilligan, a psychologist and a voice in the feminist ethics literature, characterized moral injury as a shattering of trust that compromises our ability to love. So it really helps us look at the relational lens of all of this. In 2018, Simon Talbot and Wendy Dean applied this term to medicine, really trying to argue that the term burnout implies somehow that clinicians aren't being resilient enough. So they're looking at it in a term of, if you're calling this level of psychological distress burnout, it's somehow victim blaming. They argue that burnout is really a symptom of a larger broken system and an endpoint in a longer process with multiple stages. And that by calling it burnout, what I think of in thinking about this definition is I've heard a quote and used it fairly often, that if we believe in myths, then we tend to support the wrong solutions that aren't going to be very effective. So if we believe that burnout is one thing, then we are potentially missing all kinds of strategies that might be more effective along the way. So those that are writing in this space ask us to reconsider and reconceptualize how we think about burnout and clinician distress. So they're saying that if we look at it from more of a stepwise process, where you start out with moral distress and so somebody believing that they know the right thing to do, but they can't for some reason. The longer process being moral residue. So this is the building up of some unresolved, emotional and psychological feelings that are resulting from the remaining, kind of left over after the distressful incident. And moral injury is when you actually get to that erosion of one's moral framework. So feelings of shame, feelings of disgust, and that burnout is kind of that end result. But if we can start to look at these things, maybe we can catch distress earlier. Maybe we can catch it before it becomes residue, or before the residue becomes moral injury. It's also been referred to as death by 1,000 cuts. So what are the things that contribute to moral injury within the healthcare field? RVUs, they were never actually intended to be for what they end up being used for. So they were intended really as a way of assigning from the insurance system a way to monetize things. But what they ended up being used for is productivity. So what that really does in the fee-for-service world is that instead of focusing on quality of care, it focuses on the amount of care. So let's push more and more and more to increase revenue. But that's not what it was ever intended to be for anyway. The lack of resources and the ability to do your job the way that you know that you need to, both within a system, an institution, or even understanding that systemically, your patients have a lack of resources to be able to follow up on the things that you're recommending. Financial pressures and possible conflicts of interest that those create. Physicians being put under financial pressures by other people in the organization or in smaller practice, trying to make sure that they're bringing in enough to keep their staff moving forward. Electronic records, well, for all of the good things they can do for data and tracking, they have not been something that people have dealt with easily, and they're often not really created by people who have worked in healthcare historically. So electronic records are a source of dissatisfaction for a good number of clinicians. Patient satisfaction and what that means. So are we compromising what we tell patients in order to keep them happy? Are we ordering more care than is necessary because we know that that's the way to get patient satisfaction ratings? And having payment systems that are attached to patient satisfaction really, it complicates things that really shouldn't be complicated by that kind of stuff. Fears of litigation, again, so do we overtreat, do we undertreat? Bureaucracy, fragmented care, and less than collaborative leadership. So all of these things can be the things that are the death by 1,000 cuts that lead up to burnout or moral injury. In the moral injury space, what they do talk about is the things that can compound the risk of it becoming a more distressful or, so really just increasing the distress of any one particular event. So if an event includes the loss of life of a vulnerable person, so, as somebody within an at-risk population, certainly we all get into this field to work with vulnerable populations. So when the event leads to the loss of life for one of them, when leadership is perceived as unsupportive, or if there's a perception of a lack of social support overall, when staff are unprepared or unaware of the potential consequences of decisions, and in conjunction with any other traumatic event. All of these things could increase the risk of bleeding into moral injury. Which brings us to today. We're about 9 weeks into the COVID crisis and the pandemic and stay-at-home orders. So the Primary Care Collaborative is a national organization, and they've been surveying the nation's primary care institutions and clinicians for the last 8 weeks, actually. And what they're seeing is that if things continue to get worse, and primary care practices aren't necessarily considered on the front lines of this pandemic. Interestingly, the other people that really are on the front lines of the pandemic are ones that would never have been prepared to be treated as first responders, the people working in grocery stores and gas stations and food service. At least as clinicians, we have more of a sense of what we're getting into. But many practices are struggling financially. People are definitely losing their jobs, and they have been. So people in primary care practices being furloughed. So people have the concerns, and I'm sure amongst all of you, the concerns of, do I have employment? How do I keep my staff's employment, or my coworkers have employment? What happens when I don't? Family members potentially facing unemployment. Staying safe overall and keeping the ones around us safe. Seeing that patients' needs are definitely worsening, both financially and socially. And amidst all this, we also see the inefficiencies in the healthcare system being highly pronounced, and inequities across healthcare systems and across communities being highlighted dramatically. So this gap, what we see right now, is only going to widen the gap in health disparities across communities, and we're starting to see that really vividly now. People are working from home or working while at home and trying to maintain home. There's lots of concerns across, amongst everybody about childcare or schooling from home. God forbid you have to work and try to teach your kids school, and using telehealth, whether or not you can or can't use telehealth, and all of the challenges that come around with telehealth and implementing it very rapidly, and then figuring out how to make sure that you still are being paid for it. And I know that there's a lot of people working on it, but I know that these are also things that are really weighing and really trying on all of us right now. I put a perfect storm at the bottom because there is, there's some data coming out around suicide risk. So it was on April 28th that a story about a New York City physician who had been working in the ER came out about her death by suicide. She had gotten sick, went home, went back into work, and then was sent back home. And prior to her death, her family had noted that she had become very detached, but she also had no history of mental illness. So people who are working in the very direct front lines, particularly in a place like New York City, the amount of injury and distress they are experiencing is very high, but that doesn't mean that everybody else isn't experiencing something else too. So the questions of suicide risk, I think, are increasing for our entire nation's population right now. And I put uncertainty and misinformation because we've all heard, and this is somewhat anecdotal because I didn't look up all the literature, and I'm bringing up a little bit of my own thoughts into this and the conversations that I have with others, but there's so much information and these conspiracy theories, the COVID caused by 5G, and then you hear about the Japanese hornets being in Washington State. It's a rough year for everyone. Those on the direct front line, the backup front line, and those that will be on the front line once the world opens back up and primary care is dealing with all of these folks on a longer term basis. So how do you assess moral injury? The military actually has a number of scales. I picked the military short form version, frankly, because the other versions were about 45 questions long. But this is, it's a way that they're able to get a quick sense of if somebody is experiencing moral injury. And I'm sure if I compare them next to a burnout scale, there's some overlaps that are going to be there. But feeling betrayed by leaders, feeling guilty over failing to save someone's life, feeling ashamed about doing something or not doing something that they should have, feeling troubled by having acted in ways that violate their moral values, looking at whether or not they still believe people are trustworthy or if they have a sense of what makes life meaningful, about self-forgiveness for actions or inactions. But there's a group, it's a nonprofit organization called FixMoralInjury.org, and it's a group of clinicians that are actually looking at moral injury and ways to address it in the healthcare system. And while they didn't have a screening tool for moral injuries in healthcare more broadly, they do have one that's specific to what's going on right now in the coronavirus pandemic. They actually have two. They have one for administration to complete to assess whether or not the risk of their staff being a sense of moral injury, and one that's actually for the clinicians. So I clicked through and just to see what the questions were, and this is the questions that they're asking about right now. So trusting senior leadership to guide the organization, feeling like you have what you need to do your job well. And I think a lot of these questions could be applicable even outside of the crisis. So maybe if you take the pandemic out of this, how likely are you to leave healthcare within the next year? Because obviously moral injury is something that has been going on in healthcare for many years. And so just taking some of the language in this and modifying it, I think it could remain applicable for a long time. So you screen it, find out that people have it, and what are some of the recommendations in the literature about what to do about it. First of all, much of this is about structural and organizational change. So much of the reason that those who are writing in this space talk about moral injury and try to differentiate from burnout is because burnout is really kind of placing so much of the priority on fixing the problem on the individual. So a person needs to be more resilient, they need more coping skills, they need to do this better. But what the people in this literature are really trying to emphasize is this isn't about an individual. Clinicians are resilient, they are strong, we have good coping skills. What we need is some structural change. For leadership who's trying So for an organization who's trying to actually implement some changes that will help to address and prevent moral injury, part of what you really should be doing is learning the culture of that organization and the staff within it. Doing things that are targeted interventions like promotion of work-life balance, and not just promoting it, but making sure that you give clinicians the space to actually do that. They have the 20% rule, so 20% of your work life being something that you find really meaningful and that you really enjoy. So that way, even within work, you're spending a portion of your time on something that really gives you more, it kind of gives back to you more of that energy to keep going in the other areas. and making that you're putting resources in place to enhance resilience, while making sure that you're making that it's clear, that the messaging is clear, that this isn't about, well, just go be more resilient over here, but we're going to give you all these resources to help and create the systemic changes to help do that. Additional recommendations for addressing it is we need effective leadership, and part of effective leadership is looking for informal leaders. So who are the people on the team that maybe don't have a leadership role but have a strong voice that connects really well to the rest of the team, the people who are able to give you some insights as to what's really going on with folks, know a little bit more about the personal lives of people so that you can get that bigger picture view. And I'm looking at my screen right now, realizing that I'm talking about Jamie, because Jamie has this amazing ability of connecting to so many people and knowing so much about them that she's definitely an informal leader, whether or not she would like to admit that or want me to say it out loud. We also need places to value the healthcare professionals, give them a voice, put emphasis on the patient-clinician relationship, and less on some of the things that our system has really been bogged down by for a long time. Commitments for resources, I mean, put your money where your mouth is. If you want to value physicians and value their well-being and their satisfaction, places need to make sure that they demonstrate that in paychecks. And make sure that you're creating community. So some of the biggest things in addressing moral injury from an organizational level is giving space for community, having the opportunity to brief and debrief, creating safe spaces, allowing for teamwork and encouraging teamwork. And also, I think it's important to note that we do as a society engage a little bit in hero worship. So a number of the pieces of art that I used are from an organization called Amplifier. And they have a call out to artists to try to just put some stuff out there. And there is a lot of healthcare heroes talk in the world right now. And the one thing that I worry about with that is, are we putting the emphasis on heroes so much so that when we're not able to save lives, and we're not, if clinicians aren't able to save everyone, they're not able to do the things that they want to do, are we potentially putting them at higher risk of developing moral injury because we're putting them on a platform that they'll never be able to actually achieve because of not having the resources around them? So I don't know, because I do think that people working in healthcare are heroes, but we have to be careful about how we balance that with the reality and acknowledging that they're also human. So now your thoughts, and yeah, whatever you guys are thinking about it. And we do have this slide with a bunch of resources